So now we're going to get into a discussion of wave motion. Now, let me just say that, as I said before in previous videos, the aim of this particular chapter is to deal with how do we know how the electrons are arranged in an atom. And you might be wondering, what does wave motion have to do with that? So I'm going to make a connection, but trust me, it's very important that you understand the nature of the wave and certain properties that waves display. All right, so I'm quite sure we have all had the experience from childhood where you have a rope and the rope is attached to a fixed surface like a wall, and you would hold the other end of the rope and you basically move the rope up and down, and it generates a waveform that is transmitted throughout the rope, all right? And it's very important that the waveform basically is a manifestation of the energy that is being transferred as the wave travels down the rope. And also, you should be aware that the particles of the rope themselves, rope itself, is not moving along with the wave, it's basically moving up and down. So if you concentrate on one point of the rope, for example, where this dot is, initially it will go up because the wave is passing through initially, and then as the wave passes by, that same particle or part of the rope is going down, and then it goes up again and goes down, and it just continues while the waveform is being transmitted along the length of the rope. So therefore, that's basically how the wave is generated along the rope. In terms of the different properties of the rope, or I should say of the wave, it is characterized by a couple of things. One would be the height of the crest or the depth of the trough of the wave. And there are some other properties as well, which we're going to get into. So what we're going to talk about now is, in connection to waveforms, the wave nature of light and other forms of radiation, all right? So radiation exists as what we call electromagnetic waves that originate from the movement of electric charges and magnetic fields. So just to give you an idea as to what we're talking about here. So let's say we have a beam of light traveling in the direction shown by the arrow here. It actually consists of two waveforms or fluctuations. One would be the electronic component or the electric field, which is represented in this diagram by the, I'm trying to make sense of this here. Okay, by the red line or pink line, right? So this waveform here represents the fluctuation of the electric field. And then the other one, which is at exact right angles to the first one, would be represented by the combination of black and blue line right here, this waveform right here, and that would be representing the magnetic field component of the radiation, right? So that's the reason why light and other form of radiation are said to be electromagnetic in nature, because there are two components for these types of electromagnetic radiation. You have the electric field component and you have the magnetic field component, all right? Okay. So basically, understanding waveforms will go a long way in terms of your understanding the wave nature of electromagnetic radiation, such as light and other forms, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, in terms of the characterization of waves, I talked about one of them before, and that is the depth of the trough or the height of the peak, and that is known as the amplitude. But before we get to that, I want to talk about what is known as the wavelength of a wave, including any form of electromagnetic radiation. And that is the distance between two successive peaks or two successive troughs, or as defined here, it is a distance between two identical points in consecutive cycles, all right? So, you know, this point here is identical to this point in consecutive cycles. So therefore, the distance here is called the wavelength. And that is symbolized by the Greek letter lambda, all right, which looks like an upside down Y, all right? So that's basically the symbol that is used conventionally to represent wavelength. And wavelength can be expressed in pretty much any unit of length. It could be expressed in meters, and I'm speaking specifically in reference to the metric system. So the wavelength can be expressed in meters, can be expressed in centimeters, nanometers. It really doesn't matter, right? Depending, of course, on the type of radiation that we're talking about. And then we have what is known as a frequency. Now, the frequency is a number of cycles of a wave that passes through a point in a unit of time. And the unit of time is almost always seconds, right? In fact, to be perfectly honest, I can't think of any example where the frequency is expressed and seconds is not the unit that is used to express the frequency unit. So the symbol for frequency is a Greek letter nu, which looks like a V, all right? And the actual unit of frequency is seconds to the -1. So let me write this down here. So the unit, let me put it right here, seconds to the -1. And there's a name given to that unit. It's called the Hertz unit, which is symbolized by Hz, all right? So that is the unit of frequency. And then we have the amplitude, which I talked about before. It is the wave at its height, maximum height, the distance from a line of no disturbance through the center of the wave peak, all right? So going back to, let me go back to this here. So the amplitude would be the distance from the maximum point of displacement here to the line of no disturbance. So that distance is the amplitude, all right? Okay, so those are basically the three main properties associated with any waveform, doesn't matter what kind of wave. And then we have what is known as the speed of the wave, which is basically the frequency times the wavelength, all right? So if the wave is moving at a certain speed, then that speed is given as a product of the frequency and the wavelength. Now, in terms of the frequency, as I said before, the units of frequency would be seconds to the -1, which is the same thing as hertz, and the unit of wavelength is expressed in meters in most cases when it comes to calculating the speed of the wave. So therefore, if the unit of frequency is seconds to the -1, and if the unit of wavelength is meters, then the unit of speed of the wave would be meters seconds to the -1 or meters per second, all right? So that's basically the relationship between the frequency, the wavelength, and the speed of the wave. So specifically as it relates to the electromagnetic radiation of different types, basically what you'll find, in fact, let me skip this slide and go to another slide right here. All forms of electromagnetic radiation shows wave-like behavior. And it turns out that they all travel at the same speed in a vacuum. And that speed is given by this value here. So the speed of any form of electromagnetic radiation is equal to 3.00 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, right? So that value is equal to the frequency multiplied by the wavelength, all right? So basically, it doesn't matter what form of radiation you're dealing with, the product of the frequency and the wavelength will give you this value. So what that means is that various forms of radiation will have different values of frequency and different corresponding values of wavelength. But when the frequency is multiplied by the wavelength, it will give you one constant value, which is 3.00 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So the slide I skipped over, I'm going to go back to. That slide shows you the various forms of radiation, electromagnetic radiation. And in this case, they are arranged in order of increasing wavelengths going from left to right. So we call this the electromagnetic spectrum. It's basically a list of all different forms of radiation in terms of either increasing wavelength or increasing frequency. In this case, it's in order of increasing wavelengths, all right? So at the lower end here in terms of wavelength, we have what are known as gamma rays and X-rays. These are different forms of radiation. Their wavelengths are pretty low, which means that their frequencies are pretty high. And then we have the ultraviolet radiation here, region, all right? And then there's a narrow band here. This is where we have the different colors of light, all right? Different forms of light corresponding to different colors, okay? So basically it goes from violet to indigo to blue to green, and then we have yellow, then we have orange, and then it ends up with red here, all right? So we call this the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And there's an abbreviation that I use to remember the order of the colors. It's ROIGBIV. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And this is in order of increasing frequencies. So we're talking about going the other direction, all right? So this is basically the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, as I said before. And as you can see, this region here occupies a very small portion of the rest of the electromagnetic electromagnetic spectrum. So what that tells us is that pretty much most of the radiation that exists in the AM spectrum is largely invisible to our eyes. Our eyes are only sensitive to this region right here. And I remember reading somewhere that as far as human beings go, only the female of the species can tell the difference between indigo and violet, which I believe to be true because I certainly cannot tell the difference between those two. Okay, and then now beyond that, on this side here, we have just after the visible region with increasing wavelength, you have infrared region, then you have the set of radio waves such as FM, TV, microwave, and then down here we have the extra low frequency part of the electromagnetic spectrum. All right, so that's basically what it looks like. Now, you'll notice that the frequency is increasing going from right to left, but the wavelength is increasing going from left to right. And it makes sense because going back to this equation I showed you, because they multiply, frequency and wavelength multiply to give you a constant value, what that tells you is that there's an inverse relationship between the frequency and the wavelength. So in other words, as the frequency increases going from right to left in the spectrum here, the wavelength will decrease, and correspondingly as the wavelength increases going from left to right, the frequency will decrease. All right, so that's basically the electromagnetic spectrum in a nutshell. And basically you can find out either the frequency or the wavelength as long as you know one or the other. All right, basically because the product of those two will give you the same value, which is 3.00 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. Okay, so let's talk about the continuous spectrum. Now, the continuous spectrum is that part of the visible spectrum that we were talking about earlier. Now, this diagram here is showing you, what this picture is showing you is basically a setup to produce such a spectrum. We have a white light source, which produces light, and the light passes through the slit, and it emerges from the slit in the form of a beam, and that beam is directed onto a prism. Now, this prism can be made of pretty much any transparent material, such as glass or plastic. And the effect that the prism will have on the white light is that it splits the white light into different colors, because what you may or may not know is that white light is actually a combination of the different colors of light: red, orange, yellow, etc., all the way down to violet. All right. So basically, when the light passes through the prism, it undergoes something called refraction. All right. If you have done physics, you'd have met this before. But basically, refraction is what happens when light passes from one medium to another, and it undergoes a bending as a result of a change in its speed as it passes through that medium. So that's basically what is happening to each component of the white light here. They undergo different levels of refraction, and based on that, they're separated. So basically, by the time they emerge from the other side of the prism and projected onto a screen, then you're going to end up with the continuous spectrum, right? Which is basically showing you the different colors of light. And one thing I want to say here is that it's called a continuous spectrum because, go back to this here. As you go from one end to the other, there's no clear line of demarcation between the different colors, right? So if I were to start from here, start with red, and the red color eventually runs into the orange, it's kind of hard to tell where the break is. And then from orange to yellow, and then from yellow to green, and then from green to blue, and so on. So there's no clear distinction that one can identify between the different colors, right? So we call this a line spectrum. And each color represents a particular frequency, or correspondingly a particular wavelength. So the red colored light is has a corresponding wavelength of approximately 650 nanometers. The green, approximately 500, and for the violet, approximately 450, right? So basically, different colors of light have corresponding wavelengths, different frequencies or wavelengths. Okay, we're going to stop here because the next video I'm going to talk about is where we're going to see the connection between the spectrum and colors of light and the electronic arrangements in atoms. All right? Okay, until next time.